Hello, everyone, and welcome to our sixth lecture in our course in general psychology. In this lecture, we're going to continue our theme of the nervous system, but we're going to move up from the level of individual neurons up to the brain and also the peripheral nervous system. So, the larger organization of the nervous system. So, we're going to be talking about the nervous system as a whole, and there are several divisions to the nervous system, as we'll see. And these divisions are partially structural. You have the central and the peripheral nervous systems. Well, they're also functional. Certain parts of the nervous system have a function, and as we'll see, other parts of the nervous system may have the opposite function. You may have opposing portions of the nervous system, and you can also have complementary ones. There's a whole part of your nervous system that deals with your muscles. That is a separate part of the nervous system from that which deals with your inner organs. We'll move on to the brain. What are the different parts of the brain? What do those different parts do? How are they connected? And we'll also talk about brain development and the involvement of environment and experience. How do those things affect how the brain develops? And of course, how the brain develops ends up affecting our behavior and our responses. So in this session in particular, what we're going to do is first learn the different components of the nervous system. So as I've said, there are several divisions. Some are complementary, some are opposing. But we'll see that the nervous system has a hierarchical structure. So there are different parts to the peripheral nervous system. Some of those parts have their own subparts. We'll talk about structures in the brain and their corresponding functions and how those relate to one another. We'll also understand how the brain is developed, both within a person's lifetime and also on an evolutionary time scale. So how does our brain look similar but also different from that of other mammals or that of non-mammals even? And we'll learn that the brain can change. It is plastic, as we call it, not in terms of the material, but in terms of its ability to be molded, metaphorically speaking, even as an adult. And this is a relatively new viewpoint. It used to be thought that once your brain developed, once you were an adult, that was the way your brain would always be. There was nothing you could do about it. But now we know that's not quite true. Okay, so the nervous system as a whole is a network of neurons that conveys electrochemical information throughout the body. And that's true for any animal with a nervous system. Let's break this apart a little bit. So we have the idea of a network of neurons, so individual cells that communicate with one another, pass information back and forth. And that information is electrochemical. As we saw last time, within a neuron, you have electrical signaling in the form of an action potential. Between neurons, you have chemical signaling. You have the release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is received by postsynaptic neurons via receptors. And when postsynaptic neurons receive a neurotransmitter, they will either increase or decrease the likelihood of an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, and so on and so on. So you have neurons talking to other neurons, and each neuron decides whether it's going to send a signal or not, based on all the information it's getting. And of course, these neurons go throughout the entire body. They're bringing in sensory information to the central nervous system, or they're sending out motor information, or they're just talking to one another and processing information that's already there. So the human nervous system can be divided into separate parts. You have the whole nervous system, but then you have the peripheral versus the central nervous system. So this is a big division. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. The peripheral nervous system is basically everything else. So all the nerves that go throughout your body. And of course, those nerves will eventually connect to the brain or the spinal cord one way or another. But they're not part of the central nervous system. They're out there diffusing throughout your body, dealing with sensory organs, dealing with internal organs, dealing with muscles. And so that is a big division between the central and the peripheral. Within the peripheral, you also have the autonomic and the somatic nervous systems. So the autonomic deals with internal organs, deals with physiological processes, the state of your body, uh, homeostasis. Somatic means of the body. And what that really means here is dealing with muscles, voluntary muscles. So your somatic nervous system deals with all the muscles that you can contract when you want to. So when you want to move, uh, that is the somatic nervous system in action. It's dealing with the muscles, telling them these muscles need to contract, these muscles need to relax, and that way we can move however we want to. Even the autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions, and those are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And you may have heard of the sympathetic nervous system before. It's involved in what's called your fight or flight response. So when the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated by the central nervous system, uh, what it does, it gets you ready for action, gets you ready to fight or flee. So it does things like increase your heart rate. It opens up your airways. It dilates your pupils so you can see better. It also shuts down your digestion. Now, why does it do that? Well, your body only has so much energy, and your body only has so much blood. So you have to prioritize what's important at that moment. And if you're in danger and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, you need to get ready for physical action. You need to get ready to run or to fight. And so digestion at that point isn't that important. You're not going to be able to do it fast enough to get a significant amount of energy anyway. So you might as well not worry about it if you're in real danger. The parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It's sometimes referred to as rest and digest. But it relaxes you. It slows down your heart rate, lets your airways close down a little bit, contracts your pupil. It increases digestion. And so if you're not in immediate danger, the parasympathetic nervous system lets your body use less energy. So it's more efficient. It also lets you take in new energy through digestion. So that's another big division within the nervous system. Talking about the central nervous system, as I said, the central nervous system is comprised of the spinal cord and the brain. And one of the things that the spinal cord does, independent of the brain, is spinal reflexes. So these things depend entirely on the spinal cord. There might be a little input from the brain that modifies what reflex action you take a bit, but for the most part, your brain is not involved. And the way this works is you have nerves that exit between your vertebrae. Those are the separate bones within your backbone or spine. So you have a lot of them, as we see from this diagram. And they're divided by where they are along the run of the spine into cervical, thoracic, lumbar. You've heard of lumbar support. That is supporting the lumbar vertebrae of your back. But these are different divisions. But the point is that you have all these little vertebrae that make up your spine. And there are spaces between them. These are separate bones that let your spine flex. If it was one solid piece of bone, you couldn't bend anyway. But there are separate bones, and between the bones, your nerves leave the spinal cord. And so spinal reflexes depend on these simple pathways that contract muscles in response to a stimulus. And we've already seen this diagram last time talking about the different kinds of neurons. But now we're going to emphasize the role of the spinal cord here and those interneurons. The reflex action is a response to a stimulus, and usually a pretty simple stimulus. If it's complex, if it depends on context, that's where your brain needs to get involved. But if it's a simple amount of pain, or the sensation that perhaps a muscle is about to get stretched too much, or your joint is out of position, these are all simple stimuli. And so that simple stimulus is carried via a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. And that spinal cord, the interneurons in it, will then relay the information to a motor neuron, which then causes a simple response. It causes your arm to withdraw from a painful stimulus, for example. If you've been to the doctor and gotten tapped on the knee by that rubber hammer, your leg kicks out. And that is a simple reflex. So the stimulus is being hit on that tendon by that hammer, and hitting that tendon causes the muscle to stretch. And that muscle stretch is the stimulus. It's relayed to the spinal cord, and then that information is relayed to the motor neuron in your quadricep, that is your upper thigh muscle, and that muscle contracts in response to the stimulus. Now, the thing about reflexes is they're fast. That's sort of the point. They are independent of the brain. They don't depend on the brain to work. And so they're fast, but they're also less flexible. They don't really take context into account. You've heard of a knee-jerk reaction. That's a reference to a reflex. And so because it doesn't involve the brain, you can't have a very complicated response. It's a very simple response, but it's very fast, and it keeps you from harm. And so this sequence of neurons is referred to as a reflex arc. So we go from one neuron, sensory neuron, to the interneuron, to the motor neuron. So that is the reflex arc. And that is something that the spinal cord does. It also conveys information in general, both to and from the brain. So the spinal cord is also a conduit for information getting to and from the brain. And speaking of the brain, we'll start talking about the structure of the brain. And the brain has three parts to it. There are the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And as we'll see, these are designations based really on development. You can see these different sections show up very early on as an embryo. And we can see what structures they develop into because they start as these separate components of the embryo's nervous system. We'll start with the hindbrain. And the hindbrain is, evolutionarily speaking, the oldest. So it carries out some of the really basic functions of the nervous system. You don't do a lot of thinking with your hindbrain. Your hindbrain coordinates with your spinal cord to deal with information coming in and out of the body. One component of the hindbrain, and we see it here in the lowermost section of this diagram, is the medulla. And the medulla deals with basic bodily functions, the things that keep you alive. It's the one that tells your body when to breathe, tells your heart to beat. And obviously without those things, we wouldn't be here. But it's something you don't really think about. You can have some voluntary control over your breathing, maybe a little bit over your heart rate. But you don't have to think about these things. You do them automatically. And that is the role of the medulla, to keep you alive. You also have the reticular formation, which determines whether or not you're awake. So if you're under anesthesia, those are chemicals that affect activity in the reticular formation. So the reticular formation deals with being awake or asleep. You have the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is, literally it means little brain. But it is this wrinkly structure underneath the brain that we see, or it's part of the brain, but underneath the cortex. And the cerebellum deals with motor control. It deals with coordination and to a certain degree balance. So it keeps you from falling over. It lets you carry out complex motor tasks that require a lot of coordination. Your book doesn't mention this, but the cerebellum also deals with certain forms of learning. The cerebellum is good at detecting coincidences between environmental stimuli. So in what's called conditioning, if you've heard of Pavlov's dog, of course, learned to associate food with the ringing of a bell and would salivate in response to the bell. And we'll talk about that in a few weeks. But that coordination, noticing the connection between the bell and the food is a form of learning, and that's partially involves the cerebellum. You also have the pons, and a large part of what the pons does is relay information from the cerebellum. The pons also deals with certain physiological functions like sleep. We don't understand a lot about the pons, and so we're not going to dwell on it here, but it is another one of these basic structures. You're not thinking with your pons. It deals with a lot of the stuff that you don't have to worry about. Then we have the midbrain, and the midbrain, as the name suggests, is between the hindbrain, the back part, and the forebrain, the front part. And the midbrain just has a couple of parts to it, and they're mainly involved in coordinating movement. So you have one part called the tectum, And the tectum has some subparts we're not going to worry about. But what these parts do is allow you to orient to the environment. So if there is a flash of light, the tectum helps you orient your eyes toward it. If there's a loud sound, the tectum helps you orient your head to where you can look at where the sound came from. And so the tectum really connects environmental stimuli to their locations in space and helps the body move to orient to those stimuli. You also have the tegmentum. And the tegmentum is involved in a number of things. It's involved in movement. It's involved in arousal to a certain extent. It's even involved a little bit in reward processing. Whether a good or bad event has just occurred. But really it's about coordinating those actions. And here we have the tectum and the tegmentum highlighted. So as we can see, these are structures, these little bumps that are visible, that are part of the tectum. And they sit between the hindbrain and the forebrain. You can only see part of the forebrain at the top of this diagram on the right. The forebrain itself is actually very large. But here in this diagram we can see that relative to the forebrain and even relative to the hindbrain, the midbrain is pretty small. And that brings us to the forebrain. And the forebrain is really divided into two big sections. You have what's called the cerebral cortex, which is that wrinkly surface that you see on the outside when you think of the brain and what it looks like. What you're usually thinking about is the cerebral cortex. And then you have what are called subcortical structures. So sub means under, and cortical refers to cortex. And we see from this diagram what these structures look like. And of course, these structures are not sitting on top of the cortex. This is a view sort of through the cortex, as if you could see through the cortex into the middle of the brain, which is where the subcortical structures are. So we'll start with the cortex. And the cortex is the most important part of the brain, at least for our psychological function. Obviously, things like the medulla are important for keeping us alive. We wouldn't be here without it. But the cortex is what gives rise to a lot of our psychological experience. Now, when we're talking about the cortex and that wrinkly surface, there are a couple of terms we need to know. There are gyri, singular gyrus, and those are the ridges on the outside of the cortex. And the opposite are sulci, singular sulcus, and those are the valleys. So when we're talking about that wrinkled surface of the brain, we're talking about alternating patterns of gyri and sulci. And often when referring to a particular part of the brain, especially a smaller part, you'll refer to a particular gyrus or a particular sulcus. We're not going to really get into that level of detail here, but those are important parts of describing the cortex. More importantly, we'll talk about this more, are the hemispheres. So your brain has two hemispheres with sort of a dividing line down the middle. You have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. You'll hear people talk about being left-brained or right-brained, and while that difference is overblown, there are two hemispheres to the brain. There are some functions that are handled by one side and not really the other, but for the most part, you have sort of a partner on each side of the brain. They handle opposite sides of the body, or they handle opposite sides of the visual field, or they do similar things for more cognitive functions. But the point is, there are two hemispheres, and so you'll hear me refer to the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere. And so those are the left and right halves of cortex. But they're not totally separate. There is what's called the corpus callosum, and that is this band of tissue we see highlighted in this diagram that connects the two hemispheres. We'll see later on what happens when that corpus callosum is severed. That you get some really interesting behavior. You're still very functional as a person, but that corpus callosum does have an important role to play in coordinating information between the two hemispheres. So this here that we see in the bottom left is a sliced brain. So we're viewing it from the top as though the top portion has been sliced and removed, and that's the way we can see the corpus callosum. It's not visible from the outside. It's actually toward the middle of the brain. It kind of surrounds those subcortical structures. So this is a sliced brain so that we can see the corpus callosum. Okay, a little more about the cortex. So each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. Actually, these are 4 sections of the brain. And we can see in this diagram the gyri and the sulci a little bit better. And for the most part, the dividing line between lobes is along a particular sulcus. That divides things geographically, so we can talk about different parts of the cerebral cortex. And the different lobes have different functions. So for example, I've circled here the occipital lobe, which is the rearmost part of the brain, toward the back of your head. And the occipital lobe deals almost exclusively with vision. So we have a lot of our brain devoted to visual processing, to seeing things. We depend on our vision a lot. It's much more accurate, for example, than our sense of smell. Our sense of smell is really not so great compared to other animals. Our hearing isn't so great compared to other animals, but our vision is pretty good. And partially that's because we have so much of our brain devoted to processing the visual world. And that's done in the occipital lobe. You then have the parietal lobe, which deals with things like sense of touch, deals with attention. And so a more cognitive process, attention, we'll get to that. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the course. But the parietal lobe is just forward from the occipital. It also, your simple sense of touch has a part of cortex devoted to it, and that's in the parietal lobe too. We'll talk more about that here in a second. So here, for example, is a diagram of really part of your cortex. It is the frontmost gyrus of the parietal lobe and the rearmost gyrus of what's called the frontal lobe. So here I've highlighted this rear gyrus of the two, so the gyrus in the parietal lobe. And this is what's called somatosensory cortex, and it deals with your sense of touch. And in the lower right part of the diagram, you can see the sort of disconnected human body. So you see a face, and you see an arm, and you see a leg. And what this diagram is conveying is where on this gyrus, this section of cortex, where each section is responsible for sensation on part of the body. So if you stimulate the part of the gyrus that is depicted here with a face, it will feel as though you are being touched on your face. Similarly, if something actually touches you on the face, you can record activity in this part of cortex. You'll see an increase in neuronal firing. You'll see more action potentials in that part of cortex because it corresponds to sensation of touch on your face. Similarly, if you touch the part that corresponds to the arm, if you stimulate that portion of cortex, it will feel as though the person's being touched on the arm. And if you actually touch the arm, you'll get activity in that part of cortex. And in surgery, people will use this sort of map a lot to determine where, in particular, parts of the body are mapped on the somatosensory cortex. You can actually stimulate and have the person report what they feel. Your brain actually doesn't have any pain receptors, so you can have brain surgery and be totally awake. It's not painful. So that's part of the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, back here on the upper right diagram, is the part near the temple of your head. That's why it's called that. So it's sort of these arms that wrap around the brain to the side. You have one on each side. And the temporal lobe deals with auditory stimuli and responses. So it deals with hearing. Your auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. It deals partially with language. So processing language, comprehending speech, for example. And so that is what the temporal lobe does. Then there's the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe deals with a lot of our higher functions. So planning, reasoning, controlling our emotions, making decisions. These are all parts of what the frontal lobe does. The frontal lobe also has a role in movement because that backmost gyrus, which I've highlighted now in the lower left, is motor cortex. And motor cortex is mapped very similar to somatosensory cortex. So here you have sort of the motor equivalent of what I just described for somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. If you stimulate part of motor cortex, the corresponding part of the body will move. And not because the person wanted to, but just because those neurons have become artificially active. And when those neurons are active, that body part moves. Similarly, if you want to move part of your body, and you move your arm, for example, the part of motor cortex that corresponds to your arm will become active. So again, there's this mapping between parts of the body and parts of the cortex, in this case, motor cortex in the frontal lobe. There's some other interesting aspects to cortex. There are what are called association areas. So not every part of the brain deals with a part of the body or a part of the visual world. It's not always mapped onto the environment like that. There are areas that are responsible for connecting stimuli with meaning or with connecting multiple properties of a stimulus. So part of your visual cortex, for example, determines the color of an object. Part of your visual cortex determines the shape. Part of your visual cortex determines whether it's moving and where it is in space. But these are all different aspects of a single object. And so one thing that association areas do is connect all these properties so that you realize that the thing that's blue and the thing that's square-shaped and the thing that's in your upper right and the thing that's moving to the left, that these are all the same object. And association areas also might help you identify the object if it's something complex, like a face. So that's an important part of what the cortex does, is give meaning to our environment. Another part of our cortex is comprised of what are called mirror neurons, and these are found largely in the temporal lobe. And the mirror neurons respond to actions. So if you reach out and grasp something, mirror neurons will fire. But they also fire when someone else reaches out and grasps something. So that's why they're called mirror neurons. It doesn't matter whether you do the action or somebody else does. These neurons fire, which is really interesting. So they're not involved in initiating a motor response because they fire when the other person makes the same action. They're involved in identifying action, and in particular, goal-directed actions. So when I try to do something, mirror neurons will fire, but when someone else does the same thing, the mirror neurons fire too, and we think that's what allows us to realize what other people are trying to do. It connects actions to intentions, whether they're ours or someone else's. So moving on to the other part of the forebrain, which are those subcortical structures. And there are a few of them, and they're defined not just by their structure and location, but also in terms of what they do. So in terms of where they are, they're really toward the center of the brain. And evolutionarily, these are older structures, not as old as the hindbrain, but older than the cortex. So these deal with somewhat complex functions, but certainly not as complex as the abstract reasoning that we can do and that we require the cortex for. And a lot of these are these names refer to multiple areas, that they are interconnected systems of structures. And so sometimes some of these labels will refer to a group of brain structures, not just a single structure itself. So just to go over some of the subcortical structures and their functions. There is, for example, the thalamus, which I've highlighted here. And this is sort of the sensory routing center. So all the senses, except for your sense of smell, are routed through the thalamus. They come either directly into the brain, if it's vision, or they'll come up through the spinal cord if it's a sense of touch, for example. But regardless, all the information goes through the thalamus. And then the thalamus sends axons, therefore sends information, to the appropriate part of the brain for that sense. So your sense of hearing is in the temporal lobe. So auditory information will come in and then go there. Your visual cortex is the occipital lobe. So visual information will come into the thalamus and then go to occipital cortex. The hypothalamus is, as the name suggests, under the thalamus. Hypo means under. And so the hypothalamus is involved in a lot of physiological control, in particular dictating hormone levels. So the part of your body that actually releases the hormones is the pituitary gland. But the hypothalamus dictates a lot of what the pituitary does. And so the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It's a collection of neurons, but it is responsible for sensing sort of the hormonal state of the body and adjusting hormone levels in response to those physiological statuses in the body, or in response to stimuli. Sometimes you release hormones in response to environmental stimuli. So the hypothalamus does that as well. There are the basal ganglia, which are one of these systems. It's a collection of structures. And the basal ganglia are involved in actions, involved in movement, but not in the same sense as motor cortex is. It's not involved in picking which parts of the body to move and how much to move them. The basal ganglia are really about coordinating movement and fine-tuning movement, especially movement that is goal-directed. And this is why the basal ganglia are also involved in processing a reward. So if an action is rewarding, the basal ganglia will be sensitive to that, and they can perhaps increase the likelihood of that action being performed again. So the basal ganglia are involved both in movement and actions and reward processing. Then there's the limbic system, and I haven't circled anything on this diagram because the limbic system is a lot of different areas. And it's involved in both emotion and memory. And there's some question as to whether it's really a system at all, that it's one thing. It could be just multiple things. And in particular, the most important parts of the limbic system are probably the hippocampus, which I've noted here on the diagram. And the hippocampus is one of the most important structures in the brain for memory, in particular for what we call declarative memory, which we'll get to in a later lecture. There's also the amygdala, which you may have heard of. And the amygdala is involved in emotion, in particular fear, and a little bit of anger as well. But learning about which stimuli should frighten us is part of what the amygdala does. Learning how to associate something negative in the environment, a punishment, with other stimuli, that's part of what the amygdala does. And generating our emotional reactions, especially, as I said, fear, is part of what the amygdala does, recognizing items in the environment that should cause us to be afraid. So the amygdala and the hippocampus are both part of the limbic system. And again, that's what makes the limbic system what it is. There are other components as well, but the limbic system are these interconnected regions like the hippocampus and the amygdala, which are involved in emotion, motivation, and memory. So that's the nervous system in a nutshell. We've talked about the different divisions of the nervous system. We've talked about the different parts of the brain, the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain. The forebrain being composed of the cortex and the subcortical structures. So how did we end up with all of these different parts to the brain? And the fact is that most, but not all, animals have a nervous system of some sort. So in the lower left here, I put an exception. So sponges are one of the simplest animals that exist. They don't have a nervous system. They don't have neurons. They are sort of a loose collection of cells, and they can communicate with each other by sending chemicals out into the water. But they don't have neurons, and therefore they don't have a nervous system. And most animals, but again, not all, even if they have a nervous system, not all of them have a brain. The vast majority do. But for example, jellyfish and related animals don't have a brain, but they do have a nervous system. They have neurons. And so they have what's called a nerve net, which roughly coordinates different parts of the body so they act together so that a distant part of the body can respond to a stimulus uh, that's presented to one other part of the body. So it allows sort of reflex-like movement, but nothing particularly complicated. So jellyfish have a very simple nervous system. When we get to more complex animals, especially vertebrates, and especially mammals, we have a lot more volume devoted to cortex. Not all animals have cortex. Uh, Animals can have a fore or a hindbrain, for example, but mammals tend to have a bigger cortex. So we see here in this diagram that the cortex of a frog is pretty tiny. A frog, of course, is not a mammal. But the cortex of a cat is decent sized. And the cortex of a human is quite large. And in humans, especially, the frontal lobe is larger in humans, proportional to the overall size of the organism. Relative to how big we are, the frontal lobe is really quite large in humans, bigger than in any other animal in a relative sense. And so, again, we want to avoid the idea that humans are the pinnacle of evolution, or that we're somehow the end point of evolution, um, that we are the ultimate in terms of adaptive creatures. But there is a gradual evolution up through the lineage of mammals to have more and more brain devoted to cortex, and that's non-trivial. Uh, the cortex takes up a lot of space, represents some weight, takes up a lot of energy, and so for us to have evolved that cortex, it must be worth it to have it around. And certainly we think it is. It allows us to have a lot of our cognitive abilities, and cognition is really the thing that humans do best. We are not particularly strong or big or tough, but we are more intelligent than other animals as far as we know. Uh, and we have largely the frontal lobe to thank for that. This is to say that the relative size of parts of the brain is important, but overall brain size does not necessarily imply intelligence. There's a rough correlation, but for example, whales have much bigger brains than we do. Elephants have much bigger brains than we do. As far as we know, these animals are not more intelligent or even as intelligent as human beings are. So it's not the size of the brain that really matters. Uh, Again, the proportional devotion to prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe does seem to be important. So how do our brains develop within the individual? Not evolutionarily, but from conception to adulthood. And the nervous system develops from what's called a neural tube. And that is a very simple structure in early embryos. So early on, within a matter of days and a couple of weeks, different kinds of tissue start to differentiate in what becomes the human body. So even after just a couple of weeks, you can start to differentiate the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain as they develop in the embryo. Now, they start off just being a set of bumps that are noticeable along that neural tube. But over time, over a period of weeks and then months, these things develop into the human brain. And of course, by the time of birth, the brain is fully developed in terms of being ready for birth. Obviously, our brains continue to develop through childhood and into early adulthood. Your brain isn't really fully developed until your early 20s, we think. So even as you enter college, perhaps, your brain isn't done developing, especially your prefrontal cortex. On the smaller scale, if you're wondering, well, how do the different cells go from undifferentiated, being the same sort of stuff, to developing into these different parts of the brain, part of the answer is chemical signaling. And so that neural tube, despite just being a fairly uniform mass of tissue, there are different chemicals floating around in that neural tube. And different chemicals are located in different parts of the tube. So cells can migrate as they develop. What are going to become neurons can move to one part of the tube or another based on where they detect their target chemical coming from. So if a particular cell is programmed to move toward a certain chemical, the cell can move toward that chemical, and it will end up in the part of the brain that it's supposed to. And so after cells move around and get to where they're supposed to go, then they start to develop into things like neurons and glia. Uh, and eventually, the neurons will start connecting to one another. They'll generate a bunch of synapses. At first, they generate too many, actually. And so synapses that aren't useful, that don't connect neurons that need to talk to one another, those synapses will go away. They'll die off. And that's a normal part of development. But we have both at the small scale and this larger scale, organization of the nervous system. These are ways in which neurons end up where they're supposed to go and end up talking to neurons they're supposed to talk to. Now, we used to think that once the brain developed, once you reached adulthood, that it could never change again. And this was relevant for things like the map of the brain, where different parts of the brain were, what they did, and that really doesn't change on a large scale. Um, but especially if the cortex is injured, there does seem to be some ability for the brain to kind of reform itself, to rededicate certain areas to new functions. And that's what we call plasticity. And that is the brain's ability to change throughout life, not just during development, but again, in response to injury or response to experience, the brain can change its structure on a small scale. And this is a new idea. Again, Ramon Cajal, who we mentioned earlier, when we were talking about neurons, Ramon Cajal said that the central nervous system can't really repair itself, can't change. But he also said that maybe that's something we can fix, maybe that's something we can do something about, especially when it comes to brain injury. And again, this is a principle that applies for the central nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system is really pretty good at healing itself. If the damage is extensive enough, you may not be able to heal completely, but people with nerve injuries to the body can often recover to a large extent. So for example, the brain's ability to change itself we see through phantom limb sensation. So when people lose a limb, the parts of somatosensory cortex that used to be devoted to that limb now aren't getting any input because the limb isn't there anymore. However, over time, the nearby portions of somatosensory cortex can sort of take over those neurons that now don't have a job to do. And so those adjacent areas are the face, and in the case of an arm amputation, the upper arm. And what's interesting is that people will get phantom limb sensation, especially if you stimulate the face or the upper arm. It will feel not only like the face is being stimulated, but also like that missing limb is being stimulated. And so that's evidence that the brain is changing, that those inactive neurons are now being given a new job to a certain extent. Obviously, there's sort of a mixing of sensation that touch on the face will translate into touch not just on the face, but also on that phantom limb. And also, that can be sort of unlearned. One of the problems with phantom limbs is they often experience pain. Pain that's very hard to alleviate because the limb isn't there anymore. So how do you treat pain in that limb? But again, through training, it's possible to change the brain so that that pain is diminished or even eliminated. Being a musician can often change the brain, both in terms of auditory cortex, how we process sound, but especially for those that play piano or play a stringed instrument. The areas that represent the hands will become larger. They'll take over nearby areas. It doesn't seem like you lose function in those areas. It's not like you can no longer feel anything in your upper arm because your hands are so important. But nevertheless, you do seem to have more cortex devoted to the hands if you play a stringed instrument where coordination of the hand is very important. Exercise can have a big effect on plasticity. There's been some research indicating that exercise can help the brain sort of remold itself, that things like learning are helped by exercise. And learning is a form of change in the brain. again, at a small scale, but it's a change in the brain through experience. And finally, one of the ultimate goals is to reverse what Ramon Hall noticed, that injuries to the central nervous system are irrecoverable. And a large part of that seems to be due to properties that are special to the central nervous system. Other parts of the body can heal themselves just fine, and so a lot of research is being done on how to make the central nervous system more like the peripheral nervous system with regard to healing. So sometimes when neurons die, if they're sliced, for example, if they lose their axons, in the peripheral nervous system, they'll heal themselves. In the central nervous system, they won't. And so the question is, how do we make the central nervous system to where it can heal itself more effectively? So if we're talking about development, talking about changes in the brain, we also need to talk about the role of genetics. And of course, part of that word is the word gene. And genes are technically the unit of hereditary transmission. Now we tend to think of them more as particular sections of DNA. But what genes do, why they're important, is that genes encode proteins. So they are the instructions for making a particular protein. And there are hundreds of thousands of different proteins that your body makes. And it's the combination of proteins, the proportion, or the timing that really makes cells function. But these proteins affect traits, both our physical traits, things like height, sex, eye color. Those are all produced by our genes, but they can also affect behavioral traits, as we've discovered. So you can have a certain genetic predisposition toward certain behaviors. Things like addiction, for example, seem to have a genetic component. Psychological disorders can have a genetic component. If your genes are different from someone else's, you may be more or less likely to have a psychological disorder than that other person. And genes are sections of DNA, and that DNA itself is organized into chromosomes. So you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and they're not organized in a particularly intuitive fashion. It's not like all the genes of your brain are on one chromosome and all the genes of your bones are on another chromosome. It's not that organized. But they are still consistent from person to person in terms of which gene is found on which chromosome. And that brings us to the phenomenon of epigenetics. Epi meaning outside, and genetics meaning the role of genes. So there are modifications that get made to our DNA as a function of our environment and our experience. So epigenetics is the way in which the environment affects our genes, and more specifically, affects how our genes are expressed, or whether they're expressed at all. So any given cell will not be employing all its genes to make proteins all the time. Only some of them are active. And so epigenetics is the phenomenon by which some of those genes are turned off or on by our experiences. And there are two main ways this happens. One is through what's called DNA methylation. And methylation is just a word meaning adding a methyl group, which is a chemical molecule, to a section of DNA. And if DNA has one of these methyl groups on it, it doesn't get expressed. So it's a way of shutting off genes. And certain things like stress can methylate certain genes. And that will keep them from being expressed, and that will affect the body and behavior. The other way is through histone modification, and histones are these proteins, these sort of little balls of protein that DNA is wrapped around. And it's that wrapping around histones that helps form them into recognizable chromosomes. But those histones can be modified so that the gene that's wrapped around them is either expressed or not. So that's another way that cells can change which genes are being used to make proteins and which ones aren't. And again, things like stress or exposure to certain chemicals can change the status of DNA to where it's expressed or not. And that's what epigenetics is. The idea that our traits, our behaviors are not entirely dictated by our DNA, that our environment impacts our DNA as well. Genes are also inherited from our parents. So that's why the gene is the unit of hereditary transmission. So talking about heritability, how do we inherit traits, whether physical or psychological, from our parents, and which ones do we inherit? So the thing about heritability is that it's probabilistic. So we talk about heritability in terms of numbers, in terms of how big a heritable component a given trait has. And that is to say, what is the relative impact of genetics and environment on whether we express the trait? And in psychology, a lot of heritability research is looking at psychological disorders. So if I have both parents that have depression, what's the likelihood that I'll have it? And the answer to that depends on whether depression is genetically determined or environmentally determined. And of course, very few things are entirely one or the other. So heritability indicates what the mixture is. Is it mostly genetic? Is it mostly environmental? Is it a balance of the two? But the point here is that heritability is always probabilistic. You're not fated to have a particular trait. There's some impact of random chance. There's some impact of environment and experience. Also, when we're talking about heritability, we're talking about the level of the population. So if you have a parent with schizophrenia, then you've got a higher chance of having it yourself. But again, that's measuring over the entire population of people that have parents with schizophrenia. So again, we cannot perfectly predict what the probability is, whether you'll have a disorder or not, based simply on your genetics or your parentage. So there is a role for environmental effect. So we think schizophrenia has a heritability of about 50%. Half of it is genetic in nature, but half of it's environmental. So it often takes a combination of genetics and environmental stressors to cause an individual to develop schizophrenia. Now, if you have more of one, you need less of the other. But the idea is still that there is a mixture of the two that go into developing the disorder. And that's just one example. There are lots of psychological disorders that vary in terms of how heritable they are. And the way we know a lot of this is through what are called twin studies. Now, there are two kinds of twins. There are monozygotic twins, often called identical twins, who share the exact same DNA. Genetically, they're identical. And then there are fraternal twins, which I show here on the right of these two pictures. And on average, fraternal twins share about half of their DNA. And so those are the two kinds of twins, and the difference there is how much of their genetics they share. Is it all of it, or is it half of it? And because twins are usually raised in the same environment, we can kind of average out that third factor. So we talked last week about the influence of third factors in experiments. But if twins are raised in the same environment, if identical twins have more heritability, that they're more likely to share disorders than fraternal twins are, well, we know it's not the effect of environment. The two groups of twins are raised in the same environment. We know it must have a genetic component. And so that's one of the ways we determine heritability, is by comparing how often disorders co-occur in identical twins with how often the disorder co-occurs in fraternal twins. So twin studies are an important part of our understanding of the heritability of traits and psychological disorders. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. Next time, we're going to talk about measuring the brain. So how do we have all this knowledge about the way the brain works? about the way the brain is built. So we'll talk about ways and methods that we investigate brain structure, the physical components of the brain. We'll also talk about how we measure brain function, that is, activity in the brain that accompanies behavior. And then finally, we'll talk about how to interpret these data. We can measure brain structure or brain function, but we don't want to lead ourselves astray and overinterpret or misinterpret what a measurement is telling us. And so we'll talk about how we interpret those findings responsibly. So that will be next time, and I will see you then.